As the 2022 college football season begins to come to an end, what we see when we look back can consist of a lot of things. Most people could be fixated on the fact that Texas A&M is 5-7 after having the best recruiting class of all time, or the fact that Alabama had 2 losses before the Iron Bowl for the first time since 2010. However, when we look back at 2 coaches during the 2022 season, almost everyone will see failure. These 2 people are Brian Harsin and Scott Frost, 2 guys who have eerily similar coaching journeys and now share the same fate. So with the conclusion of the season approaching, I thought it would be interesting to take a closer look at the careers of these 2 guys and find out just how similar they are. So let's get into it. We're going to start out by looking at Brian Harsin, and to understand his situation the best we can, let's first look back at where he came from. Brian Harsin's career started off at Arkansas State back in 2013. As a first-year head coach, he led the Arkansas State team to an 8-5 record, and then immediately moved to Idaho as he was hired by Boise State the very next season. Now, at Boise, he was very successful. In 7 years, he had double-digit wins in every single year except for 1. To add to this, he had Boise State in the top 25 at some point in the season every single year. I do want to clear up that I'm excluding the 2020 season just because it was COVID year and the Broncos only played 7 games that season and went 5-2. So after a very successful stint with the Broncos, he was offered the head coaching job at Auburn after they had just fired Gus Malzahn. Now, the contract offered to Brian Harsin and the one that he would take was a 6-year, $31.5 million deal. The reason that's notable is because when Gus Malzahn was fired, Auburn paid him a massive buyout of $30 million. So in the midst of a pandemic, Auburn dropped $30 million to get Gus Malzahn out the door and then immediately wrote up a new deal worth even more. When we look at the amount of money being dropped by Auburn, we have to ask ourselves where it's coming from. Because not only did these 2 things happen very close to each other, but just recently in 2022, Auburn has unveiled a new $92 million football facility. So how does a mediocre football program have this much money to be throwing around? Now, I have no actual sources to prove this, but my theory is donors. 2 of the reasons that I've come to this conclusion is 1, Auburn is listed as the 10th most valuable program in the nation, and 2, their NIL deals are more than double the national average. Let's focus on the first reason for a second. When looking at the most valuable programs in the country this season, Auburn is number 10 and finds itself behind names like Florida, Georgia, Notre Dame, Alabama, Michigan, and Texas. Now, to me at least, all of those teams being mentioned make sense just because they are staple programs within college football, or just really successful programs. Maybe the most controversial team in this list is Texas, but the reason I think it's fine is because although they might not be really good right now, they are known as a key program throughout all of college football. Auburn does have 1 more Heisman Trophy winner, but Texas has 2 more national championships, more overall program wins, and double the conference titles. Again, this is just my opinion, but the point I'm trying to make is that when we ask the question as to how Auburn finds itself in company with these programs when it comes to money, I think the answer is donors. Now let's move to the second reason, which is that their NIL deals are more than double the national average. According to the Auburn general manager and director of scouting, the average amount of money a player makes a month from NIL deals is $3,400. Auburn's players make double that at $7,400 a month. This allowed Auburn to really compete and offer the same amount of money that these other big football programs were offering. Schools like Texas, Alabama, and Texas A&M. These schools also happen to have an overall more valuable program than Auburn, which could show that these 2 reasons correlate in a way. So again, I'll ask how a football program like Auburn is able to offer the same amount or even better deals than far better programs. My theory, donors. So we're going to set this donor thing for aside right now, and we'll tie it in later. I want to look at the Auburn head coaching job and explain why it is one of the toughest jobs in the country. Auburn plays in arguably the toughest division of the toughest conference in the entire country. In the last 9 seasons, they have been in the top 10 of strength of schedule 7 times, including the 2014 and 2017 season, in which they had the hardest schedule in the country. So no matter what kind of coach you are already going to have a very difficult job when you are the head coach at Auburn. So when you get a coach that has been very successful at Boise State for the 7 years he was there, it really isn't even worth looking at because the competition of Auburn doesn't even compare to that of Boise State's. At Auburn, he was going to be competing against players with much more talent, along with facing more complex offenses and defenses because the coordinators, are more skilled. So after a look at those 2 things, and if Auburn is getting a good amount of money from donors like I think they are, then we can see how the head coaching job comes with a lot of factors and is therefore one of the hardest jobs to have in college football. So I say all that to kind of take some of the blame from Bryan Harsin, and hopefully looking at this gives you more of an idea of what he was dealing with. I hope the dude lands on his feet, and I'm interested to see where he goes next. Now let's move to Scott Frost. On paper, Scott Frost was the perfect candidate back when Nebraska hired him in 2017. He had come into a terrible program at UCF and didn't take more than 2 seasons to get them an undefeated record. It really doesn't get much better than that. On top of this, he was also a former Nebraska quarterback, so he was already familiar with the university itself. So as you can see, he was the perfect candidate, and that's why he was hired at Nebraska. From the moment that he was hired, he really didn't do a damn thing. I guess you could say the high point of his time at Nebraska was when he went 3-9, but lost 8 of those games by 1 possession, and the other loss was by just 9 points to Ohio State. So Nebraska was hanging with these other teams. It wasn't like they were just far worse than their competition, but unfortunately you don't get credit for almost winning. Looking at the other seasons he was there, his best year came in 2019 when he went 5-7, which I'm sure was not what the university had in mind as the best season under this new hire. To go along with this, Scott Frost sometimes just didn't even look like a high-level coach through little things. For example, in the first game of the 2021 season, when Nebraska lost to Illinois, he said that Illinois came out in a defensive front that Nebraska had not had many reps with in practice and had not watched a lot of film on them. So, to me, at least, that just seems like showing up unprepared. That just seems like showing up totally unprepared. Another thing that was on display this season in 2022 that has been a problem for Scott Frost ever since he got to Nebraska was special teams. There have been multiple special team embarrassments under Scott Frost, and it's a big reason why Nebraska wasn't more successful. In the opening game this year against Northwestern, they led by 11 and failed an onside kill shot, which set up Northwestern for a short field and thus opened the gate for them to take the lead, which they did and won by 3 points, and this is currently their only win on the season. A separate event that happened actually in the Illinois game that I referenced earlier was when Cam Taylor-Britt caught a punt on Nebraska's 1-yard line instead of letting it go into the end zone for a touchback, and then slipped and threw the ball out of the end zone for a safety. That is a disastrous play and an embarrassing one at that. Any disciplined punt returner knows that you don't go for a ball past the 10-yard line. And it's one thing to slightly go past 10 yards, but to be so unaware that you don't know where your feet are is something that ultimately falls on the coaches. The last embarrassment that I'll reference happened in the same 2021 season against Michigan State. Basically, Nebraska led by a touchdown with 4 minutes left and punted the ball away on 4th down. And practically the entire punt team fell for a dupe or a fake returner, which allowed the actual returner to easily stroll into the end zone for a 62-yard touchdown. That touchdown tied the game and led to Michigan State winning in overtime. So little things like that just go to show how unprepared and uncoached this team was when it came to special teams. And that may seem harsh, but that's the conclusion I draw when I look at those events. As unimportant as special teams might seem to some of y'all, it's literally a third of the game, and without a dedicated special teams effort every game, your team just can't be consistently good. Beyond the special teams, another hit on the team was the way he used Adrian Martinez. Adrian Martinez was the quarterback for Scott Frost every year he was there, besides this season, and he refused to let that man throw downfield passes, as we can see from his average target being just 8 yards. And even more than that, he never really let Adrian take the keys to the offense, even though he was clearly capable. So when we look at these two separate but similar journeys, the question I find myself asking is, how did two coaches have such great success at one program, but as soon as they move to a different team, they are so unsuccessful that it makes everyone question why they were hired in the first place? Before we try to answer this, I do want to say that although these two coaches had similar fates, the reason behind their firing isn't exactly the same. Bryan Harsin was put in a much more difficult position than Scott Frost was. Things like playing against much harder teams, and my theory of pressure from the donors gives Bryan Harsin a little more leeway than Scott Frost. As far as I'm concerned, Scott Frost does not have an excuse as to why he was not at least a little more successful at Nebraska. The school wanted him to be successful. He was their former quarterback and had proven he could be successful, so all they were looking for was a bowl appearance, and he couldn't even get them that. So that's it. I just wanted to rant about that because I think it's worth a closer look when we take a look back on the 2022 season. I hope y'all enjoyed the video, and besides that, until next time.